All right. Thanks everybody for staying here. I know everybody has things to do, but thanks for being here, taking an interest in becoming informed, because this is an informational meeting. We're going to try to present some information. We want everybody to leave here with an understanding of what is involved in hosting a vicar. We want to answer every single question that you might have. So the only dumb question is one that you don't ask and you leave here with, instead of trying to find an answer out. Now, I don't have all the answers, but we have a couple of experts up here. We have Ron. He's done a lot of research too. So hopefully we can answer your questions that you might have. When Pastor Splett announced his retirement, it had been 30 years since we had called a pastor and went through the call process. In order to learn about that, we needed to have an informational meeting, which we did, and we learned what the process was about. Now, it's been almost 50 years since we've hosted a vicar, and I didn't remember a lot about the call process, and I remember even less about when we had a vicar and what was all involved. So that's why we need to learn about it. The idea of having a vicar most recently was brought up probably 5 years ago in a voters meeting. I remember somebody asking, why don't we get a vicar? And since, when you plant a seed, sometimes it takes a while to germinate, sometimes it takes a while to grow. And since that time, the elders have talked about it more and more, and especially this last year. And I think we have an opportunity now, because we have a congregation that I think we're set up pretty well that we could do this thing. We have a pastor who's willing and able. We have the means to do it. We have an opportunity here. The idea did not come from Synod or from district. I've talked to President Saunders dozens of times over the last few years. He's never once brought the subject up saying, hey, your church needs to do this. This is coming from our congregation, from our elders, from people that think this is a good idea, that it's a good opportunity. Part of the call process that we had, if you remember, we did a congregational self-study. And part of that study was looking at our ministries, looking what our congregation is all about, and thinking about what else we could do. How else can we serve God? How else can we serve His church on earth? And that's led to some introspection, and that's another thing that's led to this day here. So I don't know anything else. So I'm going to bring up an expert here to talk about being a vicar, and he knows a lot about it since he is one. So, Vicar Cox.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a great joy to come visit other people in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, other people of God worshiping just the way I've been taught. So I really appreciate that. So yeah, I'm a vicar, and you might notice that the children figured it out correctly. I am old. I thought I could keep it a secret. So I'll just talk a little bit. I guess I don't have prepared statements, so I'm just going to do what I usually do. I am in my third year, which means I'm on Vicarage, and I'm working up in Hampton with Pastor Bullhagen. And I will say this about the Vicarage program from the perspective of a vicar: this is absolutely vital. I could not imagine going to the seminary and going through 4 years of classroom study, writing papers for professors, and writing sermons for other seminarians that are in a classroom setting with me, and then springing forth from that school and being ready to serve a church. There are things that you cannot learn in seminary. How to go and do a visitation with somebody who's shut in or somebody who's sick. We have really no good way to get that kind of experience. Writing a sermon that's applicable to folks in the parish versus writing sermons that sound pretty good to your classmate that sits next to you every day. It's absolutely vital. And I would say this: I have only been in Hampton for 2 months, I will be there for 12 months. We spend our entire third year on a vicarage assignment. And if I was sent back to the seminary for whatever reason, I only got 2 months of vicarage, it has already made a world of difference. I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't trade it. I would take the 2 months and be happy that I was able to do 2 months. It's vital. One of the things that I found out recently as I went to one of the church voters meetings up in Hampton, and maybe everybody knows this but me, I'm kind of one of those transplants that he talked about in the Bible study this morning that came from somewhere else and so found the gospel at the LCMS. But anyway, I'll get back to that. So, what was I saying, Heather? The voters meeting, thank you. So I went to a voters meeting and they were looking at the budget for the upcoming year, and we were looking specifically at the vicarage costs and the category. Does everybody know what category the vicarage program is under? It's under missions. It's mission work, and it made perfect sense when I saw it. Of course it's mission work. It's the congregation spending money, using their resources for someone who's not coming to their church when they're done. I mean, almost certainly I will not be called to Hampton, right? There's thousands of LCMS congregations. I doubt that I get called to Hampton. So it is mission work. It is under the mission budget. And I was absolutely thrilled to see that because it clicked. It's like, well, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because the congregation spends resources to put the gospel somewhere else besides where they're at so that somebody else gets a pastor that's been trained properly, that's been mentored, that's been taught to write good sermons for people and go beyond the excellent, I'm sure, theological papers that we write for each other over at the seminary. So it's already been invaluable. It is mission work. I'm ecstatic that this congregation is thinking of taking a vicar. There are not enough congregations that take a vicar right now. And it's always the same story, and it's true. It's the same story, but it's true. Resources are tight. Inflation is up. There's not enough pastors to go around. Twice as many pastors retire from the LCMS as graduate from the seminary. So even with those dwindling numbers, though, there's also not enough vicarages. So when it came time for vicarage assignment for this year, for my class, 2 of them had to volunteer to take a vicarage later on because there weren't enough churches taking us. So 2 of them had to volunteer to take a delayed vicarage. That's maybe not terrible. There's about 50-something of us in our class, but just so you know, it makes a world of difference. There's a student pastor out there looking for a vicarage assignment, and it's getting scarce. It's getting scarce. So I mean, it would be really awesome if this congregation became one that took a vicar. So I guess that's what I have to say off the cuff. I wonder if there's questions for me. If not, I'm going to tell the truck story. Okay, I guess I'll tell the truck story then. And I have to keep backing up forever, so you get part of my conversion to Lutheranism built into the story. I was raised as a kid as a Pentecostal. And if you have ever, for whatever reason, your life didn't have enough misery in it, I suppose, turned on YouTube and looked up the kind of wacky things that Pentecostals do with the speaking in tongues and the slaying in the spirit, running and jumping up and down and making utter chaos in their churches, I thought that was normal. I was raised in the 80s and went to a Pentecostal church, and that's the kind of churches I always went to. I always thought that was normal. Now, it turns out Heather and I are from the same small town in Oregon, state of Oregon, and she was raised LCMS. There was an LCMS congregation down the road. And because it's a small town, this might resonate, her mother and my aunt were best friends. And we lived across the street from each other. My Aunt Mona, she did go to the LCMS church. So I did get over there a few times when I was a kid to go to like vacation Bible school. And I can't remember exactly when the first time I encountered a divine service, but it made no sense to me whatsoever. The pastor stood up at the front, and when he said a prayer, he wasn't just making up whatever came to mind and pretending the Holy Spirit had led him, because that's what we did in the Pentecostal church. He was reading a prayer that had been written down like 150 years ago, and I thought that was pretty strange. And later in life, when I was able to attend the LCMS church more because my mother-in-law is an organist at that church. And she would invite us and we would go. Well, later the pastor would be up front at the beginning of the service and he would look out to me and everybody else and say, I forgive you your sins. And as a Pentecostal, I was like, well, he can't say that. That's blasphemy. Only Jesus can forgive sins. Now, I think we had that reading just shortly ago, or maybe it's coming up, where Jesus forgives the sins. It's coming up next Sunday. Jesus forgives the sin in front of the Sadducees, or maybe it was the Pharisees, but he forgives sins, and they accused him of blasphemy because he said he forgives sins. So I was kind of in the other role there. I saw him forgiving sins, and I said, I don't understand that. But this pastor was my age, and he was pretty new out of seminary, second career guy. So he was somebody I could easily talk to. So I went up and I asked him, I go, why are you standing at the front of the church and saying that you forgive my sins? And what did he do? Did he say, oh, that's just the way we do it around here? No, he opened up the Bible and he showed me in the Word of God where Jesus gave that authority to his apostles, that they were to go forgive sins. He showed me in the Bible. And when I had a similar question about baby baptism, because don't we all know, if you were Pentecostal or Baptist, you would know what I'm about to say. A baptism is a good work that you do to show to the congregation that you are a Christian. Yeah, you're already a Christian. You're going to show everybody by getting baptized. That's what they taught in the churches I was raised in. So I asked him about that, and he showed me in the Bible where households, entire households, when they were converted to the faith, were all baptized together, and he showed it to me in the Bible. So I like to say that the Pentecostals, they get a lot wrong. They make a lot of mistakes. But they got one thing right. They do believe that the Bible is the Word of God. So in spite of the errors, I got that pounded into my head from a young age. The Bible is the Word of God. So if he could show me in the Bible, if that pastor could show me in the Bible why what he was doing was correct, then I had to accept it and had to believe it. So I studied it more and more to figure it out for myself. But here's the clincher. I had some theological attending these kind of charismatic type churches. I used to go to a Calvary Chapel fellow that ran that church, Pastor Alex Kovacs. He was really smart, and he taught a lot of good stuff, actually. And one time he said that the LCMS have good doctrine, because the pastor figured out that Heather was from an LCMS congregation growing up, and he mentioned that to me. Oh yeah, I've run into some of those Missouri Synod guys. They have good doctrine. So I was able to trust that process, or trust the words from an LCMS church, because a pastor I trusted said they had good doctrine. But now this Lutheran pastor, who knew I had had theological training and had provided some correctives to it, which I was ingesting, he was taking a call and leaving our little church in Oregon behind. He was going to go on down to California. Good reasons. I knew he had. And well, he was teaching a catechism class. He was teaching a small catechism class with one student. And he came to me, and this congregation had 18 people. I mean, it's a tiny little congregation in Oregon where the shrinking of the churches has hit particularly hard in the Northwest District. So there might be 18 or 25 people at that church, and it was shrinking. And he came to me and he said, I need you to take over that that catechism class for me. And I said, Pastor, I've never been to a catechism class. In my whole life, I've never been to one. And he said, you know what, though? If you don't do it, nobody will. There would be a young person who wanted to know more about church and God and the Bible, and there would not be somebody if I didn't do it. I'm not trying to make this about myself. I hope you can internalize what I'm saying. Don't think that if you don't take a vicar, that there is somebody else that will. There might not be somebody else. Please keep that in mind, because that hit like a ton of bricks, and it led me step by step to going to the seminary, because I had to study the small catechism frantically the day before I was teaching it to the students so I could stay ahead of her. So I would be studying it, and I would teach her, and I would study it some more. And I started ordering books from Concordia Publishing House, and my bookshelf started stacking up with all these maroon-colored books. And I would start watching videos online to figure out more about how the Lutherans were running the church services in other places in the world. And this is one of my, I am going to get to the truck. I haven't forgotten the truck. But the one of the videos I watched, there's really only two main ones that I watched. I would watch Redeemer Fort Wayne, and that was really fancy, but it turned out that's like the only church in the whole world that does the services the way they do. So that wasn't as helpful, it turned out. But the other one I watched was Matt Rieger in Hubbard, Iowa. I had no idea that there was any chance that I would get anywhere near that church and this pastor, but those were one of the videos that pops up on YouTube. So I watched many of his services to learn how divine services were done over in the Midwest. And I got to meet Matt Rieger at the Winkle the first time I met you, actually. I also met Matt Rieger and Pastor Rieger, and that was pretty exciting for me. Here's this fellow that to me was like a YouTube star, and I got to meet him in real life. All right, so the pastor said I had to take over the catechism class, and I did, and he moved to California, and I taught the class. And it turned out I was going to be going to the seminary. Well, I needed a truck. I needed a truck really badly because we had lived in the same house for 15 years, and we thought that we would never move out of it. I would just grow old and be a civil engineer, by the way, be a civil engineer and then retire, and that was it. And then suddenly we had to move, and I didn't own a full-size pickup truck. So Pastor Behringer, Vincent Behringer, by the way, he had a truck that he would sell me. So we flew down to Los Angeles and got his pickup truck because he sold it to me for a really good, seminarian type price. And we drove it back to Oregon, and we bought a trailer. We tried to get as ready as we could, and we spent months getting rid of stuff, hauling things to secondhand stores, loading up that trailer with like too much stuff. If you're my age, and by the way, I'm 51, just to put it out there, I'm 51. If you're my age, you probably own like 1 million things, about 1 million. Like I think if I counted all the stuff I own, it's about 1 million. So I'm trying to load this stuff up, and I load this awesome trailer up, and I have a half-ton pickup truck that I bought from Pastor, a 2009. And that morning, that fateful morning, the truck is loaded. I've sold the house, and I'm lowering that trailer down onto the truck, and that bed of that truck just kept dropping and dropping and dropping until it was like that high off the ground. The house is gone. I need to leave because there's people coming to buy it from me. And I had to go, and I didn't know what to do other than drive away. And one thing about Oregon that might be different than what you've seen if you've lived in Iowa a long time is there are mountains, like actual mountains with mountain pass roads. And so right out of our hometown in Eugene, Oregon, we have to drive east. Am I holding it too low? Okay, sorry. I'm trying to not. You would like that? Okay, but if the P's come out like that, it's your fault. There are mountains in Oregon, and that trailer was practically sitting on the ground. And I went over the first mountain pass about 100 miles from home into Eugene, Oregon, and the truck had it. The engine was making a funny noise. My dad's pretty handy with that kind of thing. So I got out, called him on my cell phone, held the phone up to the engine. What's going on? He said, well, it could be something simple like a blown gasket, but it could be that the engine's going to die. And the problem was this was in the middle of COVID, and it was a weekend, and I was 100 miles from home, of which I didn't have a home anymore. So we were kind of stuck, it looked like. So we called up the dealership and said, well, can you guys look at this truck? It's making a funny noise. And they said, no, it's COVID, and it's the weekend, and nobody's here. And so, I mean, this was the beginning days of COVID, like June of 2020. So I said, well, what do you suggest I do? I said to the lady on the phone, because I'm at a loss here. I don't know. What am I going to do? Like just live on the side of the road, And she said, well, you should buy a truck. I'm a salesperson, so my advice is you come buy a truck. I thought, well, that's outrageous. That wasn't in my schedule. It wasn't in my budget. So I went to the dealership, and God gave me a nice, big, new truck, and I drove it here today. So that's the truck story of how, like, on the eve of moving to seminary, I ended up with a 2018 Ram 2500 3/4 ton heavy-duty truck that can haul the trailer, and you don't even know the trailer's there. So God wanted me to have a truck, and I've tried to the best of my ability, I've tried to put it to His use, because I don't think God wanted me to have a truck so that it looked really shiny and sat in my driveway. So I signed up to be the moving committee guy at the seminary. And so every time somebody was moving into or out of Fort Wayne for the seminary, Heather and I would show up and help them load things and unload things. And then inevitably they've got some giant heavy thing that it turns out they can't take with them, and it goes into the truck, and I haul it to the seminary, and we put it in one of the co-ops so some other family can use it. So that's the truck story about how God decided I needed a new truck to come to seminary. It probably doesn't make you now have a crystal clear decision about why you need a vicar, but I always feel like I have to tell that story. It's probably my Pentecostal upbringing, you know, sharing stories.
So here's my question, and I know the answer, but I want you to give the answer because you're standing and talking.
Yeah.
The way that you spoke earlier, and I think this might not be clear to every member of our congregation, you said that there are men who were studying to be pastors that did not get, there were 2 men who volunteered to have a delayed vicarage.
Right.
That makes it sound like the vicarage is required to be a pastor in the Missouri Synod. Does every man going through the seminary, does he have to do a vicarage or not?
To the best of my knowledge, we all have to do a vicarage, yes. And it's a little bit like kicking the can down the road, because if there were, let's use numbers just to make them up, if there were 50 men that needed a vicarage, but only 48 churches to take them, well, they delayed their vicarage so that they will, instead of doing 2 years of study, 1 year of vicarage, a final year of study, they will do 3 years of classroom study, and their vicarage will be their final year. But what happens when those 2 guys join the class behind them, and now that class is enlarged by 2 because there were 2 guys that didn't fit this year? So that can be a snowballing problem, since we all do have to serve a vicarage in order to be pastors in the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod.
Thank you. Does anybody else have questions for the vicar? Otherwise, lest he tell another truck story, we can ask other questions, not directed towards the vicar, but questions about anything else about the vicarage program.
They asked me to talk about the money. Go figure. The letter that was handed to you, it kind of things are, and I went through it out on the things that we have a good number for anyway. Obviously, the first one is the $2,000 per month for the salary. Even a simpleton like me can figure out that that's $24,000 a year. The vicarage fee is a one-time fee of $605 a year. Housing and utilities, we looked into the carriage house with rent and utilities. You'd be looking at about $700 a month. So that's $8,400 a year there. The health insurance is pretty plain there, $4,158. I don't know if that's a 2022 number or 23. That those usually change from year to year. And we're looking at here a single individual, because we really, if we were to request a vicar, it would necessarily probably have to be a single person, as we do not have adequate housing for a family. And many of them do have families. We would have to pay the employer Social Security and Medicare taxes. That would be another $1,488 for Social Security and $348 for Medicare. Those numbers come to a total of $38,999. And those, again, that's kind of an estimate on some of that. Mileage is now 62.5 cents a mile. So we pay the mileage for the vicar when he's going doing work for the church. And then we would pay for the vicar to move here, and then also move back to Fort Wayne or St. Louis, depending on where the vicar would come from. So we would probably be looking at somewhere between $45,000 and $50,000 a year for this. And I know that's a big number, but this congregation has always been very, very generous. The giving has exceeded our expectations, especially since 2020. In 2020, when we weren't having services, we didn't have a steady pastor. I think we went through 3 or 4 pastors that year. The giving actually was astounding. It kept coming in. as though everything else was normal. And that was really great. Our expenses are less now because we do have a new younger pastor who the way the salary system works at the district and to the Synod is based on years of experience and how much the size of the congregation and several things like that. So yeah, in terms of that, we I think even if we didn't already have the funds available, we have the funds available. We're giving a congregation and could probably afford it without anything else. If you remember, this year we had a very generous gift to the congregation. We've set up $665,000 of that for a scholarship fund. Bernadine and Ernest had two loves in their life. One was children. They didn't have any children, but they loved children, and you and your children became their children. And that's why they gave that money to the church for that purpose. Now, they also left another $665,000 to the church, and that is for, I believe, education. That's what Bernadine always talked about, is she wanted people to be educated and serve the Lord in whatever path they took. Vicar Cox said that he was a civil engineer. And this is something that I have seen time and time again. The people that go into being pastors for us could go out in the secular world and make 2 to 3 times the money. They have the intellect to do that. Amazing intellects. But they chose, because they were called by the Lord through the Holy Spirit, to serve us. And this is an opportunity for us to serve the Lord by raising up pastors for the harvest. So in terms of those dollars that we got from Bernadine for the scholarship funds, we expect to earn yield of 6 to 7%. We will receive every year $35,000 to $45,000 to hand out to your children going to college. Now, you might wonder, where are we getting that kind of yield from? Well, we have the people that can do this. It is just like owning farm ground. You own farm ground. It doesn't matter whether it's worth $1,000 an acre like it was when I moved here, or $17,000 to $18,000 like it is now. That doesn't affect the crop. And the way we invest this money are things that are available that will fluctuate up and down just like cropland does, but the crop keeps coming off. Now we're in harvest time. Where do we put the grain? We put it in bins, and we wait till the right time to sell it or to move it to meet the needs. It's the same way with the scholarship fund. It is going to be set into an account, set in there waiting until children need it for their tuition, and get distributed by the scholarship committee at that point in time. We can do the same thing with the other $665,000. And I just talked to the investment person that does this for us and the group of people that do this, and that's their goal, is 6 to 7% yield. So if we can try to generate $35,000 to $45,000 a year from this $665,000 and never use the principal, this is something that we can go on year and year and year. And we can easily make up the difference if it runs more. Things go up in time. The other thing is that because we're a generous congregation, there's no reason why some of us can't contribute to the Vicarage Fund. Some of us can't contribute to the scholarship fund. Bernadine, one of the things she told me, I hope people see this and say, this is a good thing, and I want to add to that. So to me, this is the Great Commission for us, that we are told, the Savior told the apostles, go out and make disciples, go out and baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So this is a way for us to raise up more vicars for that purpose, because we need them. One of the other things that I did hear from past discussion was, well, that should be the bigger churches where all the money is. Well, the bigger churches do have money, but some of them have as many financial problems as some of the smaller churches do. That doesn't just automatically make it work better. So I did a look at all the vicars that were placed into Vicarage in 2021. And I took a random sample of 15 churches to see which church, what the size of the churches were that took them. Of those 15 churches, 8 were larger than us, 7 were our size or smaller. So the size of the church is not an issue either. Anybody have any questions for me? Yes, Roger. Housing? What was the question? Carriage house. We have an apartment. They've told us they have an apartment available for $550. I don't know which direction I'm in here. Carriage house at $550 a month plus utilities. Cassidy lived there. She said utilities ran her about $150 a month. And it's real close by too, so we can get we can bug him easier that way. Anything else? I can't think of one. Like Vicar Cox said, this is a mission field. We have always done a good job of missions, and this is an opportunity for us to do much, much more. Much, much more. So if you have friends that aren't here today and they have questions, you'll be glad. I guarantee that this vicar is here. He's not an associate pastor, but he's here to learn how to be a pastor.
Right. Yeah. Right. So over in Hampton, I've been there for 2 months, and the question is, what do I do on a daily basis? So I preach about every other Sunday. So I'm constantly preparing a sermon. Pastor Bullhagen's good at getting me to start that process more than a week in advance as for training. Anyway, so I do that. I prepare a sermon every 2 weeks. I teach confirmation class to 8 children, 5th, 6th, and 7th graders. He has the 8th graders. Pastor Bullhagen teaches the 8th graders. So I have 8 confirmation students that I teach once a week. I teach a weekly Bible study. I chose the book of Revelation. I'm just mentioning it. It's kind of the best book in the whole Bible. So I teach and he let me pick whatever I wanted, which was maybe his mistake. Okay, so twice a week, and this is a little thing, but it's really nice. We have right next door to the Hampton Church is a Christian daycare. And so twice a week we go there for 15 minutes in the morning, Pastor Bullhagen and I, and we teach memory verses to 3- and 4-year-olds. I mean, they're so little. And it was interesting because when I showed up, it was the end of a year-long cycle, and the number of children at the daycare up during the summer because they're not in school, and so there were older kids there, but older grade schoolers. And I walked in with Pastor my first week there, and school hadn't started yet, so all these older kids were there still, and they recited with Pastor. I don't think I'm exaggerating. It's probably a dozen Bible verses, and they were running circles around me on knowing and reciting Bible verses. It was really heartening to see because these children, they will never, ever forget those memory verses. I know they never will, because some of the ones still stuck in my head is when I was going to Child Evangelism Fellowship. My mother used to teach what was called Child Evangelism Fellowship, and they would let elementary school kids out of school and teach them Bible verses and such during the school week. anyway, so they're never going to forget. And it was amazing. It was like, but then school started and all those bigger little kids went to school. And the next time I showed up, there was about 5. It went from like 25 and 30 children to 5 and 6. And it was good for me because we were starting over with one memory verse. So I got to do it in order. So anyway, it's a small thing, right? It's, of the whole week, it's only maybe 30 minutes of my time, but it's amazing. So we teach on Wednesdays and Thursdays. We go to the daycare and teach for a moment. I accompany pastor on his shut-in visits, where he gives a little devotional, leads the homebound person through absolution, confession, absolution, and he gives them communion. So I accompany that. And so now that I've been there for 2 months, obviously I won't be giving communion because I can't do that, but I go do some of my own visits now. So now I'm going and doing some visitations on my own. I'm not sure if I've forgotten what. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, right. I teach Sunday school also to a similar group. So after the divine service, I go teach the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And what I've done in this case was that we're going through the Old Testament. I don't know how everybody else does it. I've still never been in a confirmation class that I wasn't teaching. So I have to like always wonder, is this the way they do it? I mean, this is how I do it. Anyway, so we're going Old Testament for 1 year, and it's my turn, so I'm the vicar. The next vicar after me will teach the New Testament to those same children, and in their 3rd year, pastor gets them for their 8th grade year, and he teaches them to memorize the small catechism. So the Old Testament is huge, right? It's really big. And so trying to get through the Old Testament on like 25 Wednesdays, I had to cut a lot out. So for Sunday school, the lessons that I skip on Wednesday confirmation, I have some of the same children in Sunday school, so I fill in the gaps during Sunday school. So I think that's basically it. I'm either preparing a lesson, teaching a lesson, going on a visit, writing a sermon. Oh yeah, okay. So does everybody know, or some of you know Pastor Bullhagen? Anybody knows Pastor Bullhagen? You know him? Okay, yeah. So he's an interesting guy. I'm actually a little older than him, and he made a big deal of that. And he introduced me to somebody as his father, and I'm 2 years older than him. But anyway, so he's an interesting guy. So one of the things he does is this podcast that's based on pastors sharing kind of the inside scoop of what's going on being a pastor. He likes to say, the show that shows you what's behind the collar. And so I don't know if anybody's listened to the Clerical Errors podcast, but once a week we record a podcast in a little recording studio that he set up, and it's out on the internet. It's out on, I don't know, Twitter and wherever else he posts it. But anywhere that you could get a podcast, which is just listening to other people talk, right? So I record the podcast with him. So years ago, when he started this thing, he just refers to the vicar as just vicar because I'm his 19th vicar for one thing, so he probably has forgotten my name, but not really. But he just calls me vicar, and so every time he has a vicar on his podcast recording studio, he just calls them vicar. He doesn't have to remember names like on the fly. It's really funny though. Like if you like humor, and you might want to listen to the Clerical Errors, and you probably hear the play on words there, right? A clerical error. I probably don't have to explain it, but I might. It sounds like a mistake that a secretary would make, a clerical, but we are wearing clerical collars, so there's the inside joke. Anyway, I've over-explained it. So I also do the podcast. How much time does Pastor Bullhagen spend with me? Yeah, I was thinking about that actually. Like, am I a net positive on his time? Am I helping him in a way that frees him up? And I'm not sure that I am. I think he's probably has as much work to do training me, making sure that I know what's going on, or at least he does it. It might get better over time. Brand new like me, and I don't even know, what be facing during the church service. And so at first it was a lot, and then I guess, as 2 months have now gone by, he lets me he's got a little office for me. So I have my own vicar office, and I mostly during the day I'm in there writing sermons, preparing lesson plans, and he comes and proactively checks on me. And if I'm being really good and remembering the way I ought to be, I go get his help and not just sit there spinning wheels. So I go get his help. He checks on me. But I think I might be a little bit of a net gain on his time to free him up a little. Like if I'm doing a visitation, then maybe that frees up his time a little. And if I'm preparing a sermon, I like to think that that frees up a little of his time. But it's hours every week, maybe like, especially at the beginning, like, I don't know, 10 hours? I don't know. Okay. How much help is he to me in sermon preparation? A lot. I mean, this is where the Vicarage program does its most good. He told me this would be true, and in 2 months I can see already it is true. I will gain the most in my sermon prep skills during the Vicarage. That's where I'm really going to gain, because I went from I've written as many sermons for him in 2 months as I think I wrote in the 2 years in seminary, because I did maybe 3 at my fieldwork church. If you don't know about seminary fieldwork church, we are all assigned a local church in Fort Wayne, and we attend that church and we help out the pastor. And those guys are troopers, the churches that volunteer to have field workers, because we show up and we don't know anything. You know, if I didn't know very much up to Vicarage, we'll multiply that by like 10 or 100 for how much I didn't know when I showed up to field work. But in that time, I prepared a few sermons. You know, I thought they were pretty good until I got here and Pastor Bullhagen got a hold of me. But anyway, yeah, he comes in and checks on my sermons. I'm his 19th sermon or vicar, so he's really quick at diagnosing it. He looks at that manuscript, which he makes me write by hand, by the way. Are you going to make your vicar write their sermons by hand? Oh, okay. I was going to see if I could transfer, but anyway, so you can't transfer. Anyway, so yeah, he has me write them by hand, and then he looks at them. And then he does massive surgery on them. The first sermon that I preached in Hampton, I called it version 2.5. And without any exaggeration, it had 0% of the original manuscript that I wrote made it to the final version. And only half of the second version made it to the final. That's why I called it version 2.5. And anyway, so it's very helpful because he's teaching me writing techniques that I had not picked up at seminary. I'll give an example because I think it's fascinating and it's very helpful. The last sermon that I did a week ago today, he had me, look at the pericope. I like to look at the Greek language and do some studying of the grammar. That's what they teach you in seminary, which is good. And then he told me, I want you to read that scripture, and I want it to be that you are preaching that sermon to yourself. What is it in that Bible pericope, that New Testament reading, that you need to hear, and the maybe improvements you need to make? So I had to write the sermon like I was in the hot seat. That was the name of that exercise. Put yourself in the hot seat. And it dramatically changed the nature of the sermon. There was an element to it of tattletelling on myself. And just because I'm not a very secretive guy, I'll tell you, like when I wrote the sermon, started writing it with that in mind, when I went home for lunch that day, because I just walked back to the Vicarage house, it's just 2 blocks away, I had to apologize to Heather for behavior that was coming out in my sermon. And then I got her permission to actually use that bad example of behavior that I needed to apologize for in the sermon, because I guess we're both not very secretive. But it had to do with finding a higher seat for yourself. Maybe you had that sermon, it was last week, right? The sermon where Jesus told the Pharisees and lawyers, when you go to a wedding, don't seat yourself up high and then get totally embarrassed by getting told to sit in the lower seat because somebody more important than you showed up. And so I looked at my life and I found a way that I was putting myself higher at the terrible high cost of making my spouse feel lesser. And the very example I used, because I tell you I'm not secretive, was it's a dumb example, but the example, it's true. When I was making iced tea at home, I was assuming that I did it perfectly, and that if I wasn't looking when she did it, she had done it wrong. And I know it sounds minor, but I was excusing myself, and I could see that I had hurt her feelings on that occasion. And I just kind of ran forward like, well, this isn't very important. The important thing is that we get this done the way I want it done. And so that's what my sermon ended up having as the object lesson, was that, like, what a stupid, trivial thing to put ahead of a relationship with your beloved. So anyway, so that's one of the things he's teaching me, is very practical ways to write sermons so that they're for people. And that's what I meant. Like, he's seen 18 other vicars before me, and we all show up and do the same thing. We write our sermon, and it is an excellent theology paper to turn into a professor, and a pretty miserable sermon. So. Does it increase the skills of the pastor to critique what the vicar is doing? It seems like it would have to, because I certainly learn things best myself by having to teach them to someone else. So I think it sharpens his own iron, so to speak, as well, to be making sure that I'm doing the best sermon. Because it would be hard for him to tell me to do things and then he himself wasn't practicing them. So I think it keeps him on his toes to have to diagnose these sermons and make sure I'm preaching to real people and not to theoretical. I mean, one of the other things he told me was, like, be careful not to write a sermon where you kind of pick a flaw and sort of assume that you better talk about this flaw so the people know they better not, commit this flaw. And I can't think, usually it's the Pharisees, right? Jesus is always chewing out the Pharisees, it seems like. And, don't be too legalistic on Sundays or something. And he will stop us vicars from writing a sermon that picks apart at a flaw that nobody has. We're not allowed to flaw apart and like have a whole sermon on some flaw. And it turns out we're just sort of, well, no, I don't struggle with that. I'm not legalistic on Sundays. And then he's looking at you like, well, nobody else is either. That's not the point of the sermon. So he's given really good practical advice like that. And I think it must be that his sermons are better for teaching others for 19 years.
If anybody else doesn't, I know there was one concern that was raised the last time that we had this discussion, and that concern was whether or not the pastor that you currently have enough time to take on a project like this. Because vicars, as Vicar pointed out, vicars do take work. It takes time from the pastor, and I have, as I'm sure you all know, a lovely family that also takes time. Katie's gone. She already took the kids home because they were done. I've talked to, Ron asked this question. I think Vicar answered the question very well, that at the beginning, when the vicar first comes, the first 2 months, probably a negative, and that's not speaking against you, Vicar, at all. But just because the vicar has to be taught, this is how much time I have to invest in the vicar's sermon. He needs to learn a better way to do things, and learning the ropes of the congregation. But after 2 years, or 2 months, sorry, maybe it feels like 2 years, Vicar. After 2 months, he starts to gain traction, and he requires a little bit less time of the pastor. And then eventually it does. I've talked to other vicarage supervisors, not just Bullhagen, but a couple of my classmates from the seminary, that eventually the vicar does turn into a net, either net equal or most often a net that the pastor is able to spend more times on other projects that perhaps the vicar won't be able to spend time on, or being able to spend more time. So that is something that we should keep in mind. It is a good question. I'm thankful for a congregation that is looking out for her pastor, who is concerned and wants to make sure that the pastor takes care of his family. But I assure you that I will still take care of my family, and I will have enough time and effort to put into taking care of the vicar and make sure he has the education that he needs. Trying to think if there were any other concerns that were brought up last time. Oh, that maybe it was too early. Yeah, that I had only been here for 1 year. Well, now I've been here for 2 years. That anniversary was at the end of last month. I praise the Lord for 2 years to be with you guys. I heard the best compliment that I've ever heard from one of our elders at the last Board of Elders meeting, that some people have been coming up to him a lot lately and saying, wow, we're really getting used to this guy. Having come from North Dakota, that is a huge compliment. It takes a lot to get used to somebody, and so I think that now I think now I'm getting used to you guys too. And I think that now I understand the congregation even better, and I think now is a very good time for us to consider this opportunity, this mission project. If you have any questions individually, I really recommend you can come and talk to the Board of Elders, or you can call me up and talk to me, come into the study or call me up anytime. That way we actually have a chance to talk to each other and talk through these things so we can have a source to the answer to the questions rather than just talking amongst ourselves, which sometimes doesn't breed the unity that the church really ought to have. So this is going to be on the voters' agenda for next Sunday. The president is aware of that now, or the chairman of the congregation is aware of that now. So please prayerfully consider this opportunity this week for our congregation. If I could sum it up, we can financially support it very easily, it sounds like. We have a place for the vicar to live. We haven't rented an apartment yet, but we were assured that we'll get the top of the list should we decide this. There is a great need in our church for this program, and it's a need that we can very easily step into and very strongly support our church in this way. So there you go. You guys have anything else? Okay. God bless you.